Good evening and welcome back to our study, God of Restoration, Poetry and Prophecy in Isaiah 40 through 55. We are in Isaiah 52, just the last three verses today, and all of chapter 53 for lesson 11, the suffering servant. And we're getting closer towards the end of the book. In some ways, this chapter provides kind of because it provides kind of a surprise, it provides sort of a climactic point, depending on how you mark it, for the section that we've been looking at. So exciting stuff in Isaiah 53 today. Before we do that, let's review last week's lesson. So last week we did good news from Isaiah 51:17 through 52:12. So if you want to look back at that, in 51:17, we saw some portraits of Jerusalem personified as a person, which, is a pattern that we'll see. That'll be in the lesson again next week. So that Jerusalem as person returns later, that idea. And Jerusalem was these were descriptions of Jerusalem's suffering, or the suffering of the Israelite people through the exile. And we saw several different portraits. What stood out to you from 17 through 23 of chapter 51?
He's always saying, wake up or rise up.
Yeah, that awake, awake, or rise up, rise up. It's a repeated phrase, and it seems to be like really calling the people to attend, that, to focus their attention on God and God's message and this message from the prophet. Yeah, absolutely. Awake, awake.
He's also talking about the cup.
The cup, right? The cup of wrath. Is
Yes.
the way that it is put, or the chalice of reeling, like or of staggering. Some translations will have it. And so we saw kind of the metaphor. What was it like for Jerusalem to suffer the consequences of their sin in the form of the exile? It was like drinking a poisoned cup. It was like being a mother whose children are either deceased, or maybe not, and then the metaphor shifts and it's maybe knocked out by that same sense of a poisoned cup, or being someone who has been abused. Lay down and let us walk all over you is kind of the message that the tormentors are giving. So we saw this very vivid series of pictures of the suffering that they have undergone, and that sense that God really does recognize that it doesn't take lightly this. Go ahead, Judy.
I was just clearing my throat.
Oh, sorry. Okay, your little box lit up, and I thought you said something.
Oh,
Uh,
interesting.
yeah. So just this, and then we hear, "Thus says the Lord, who contends for his people." So we had that drawback to the idea that if God is for us, who could be against us? If God is on my side, who could contend with me? So God, who contends with his people, has taken out of your hand the cup of reeling, that the chalice of anger is what it's called. So, really a very vivid view of their suffering. And then it goes smoothly into wake up again, like Shirley pointed out, and Jerusalem is going to rise up clothed in beautiful garments, out of the dust, the chains removed. And so that sense of being freed from the suffering, being freed from that low position. Yeah, any other thoughts on that from last week?
How beautiful on the mountains are the feet of them who bring good news, proclaiming peace and happiness.
Yes, that we know that passage because it is quoted in the New Testament as well. And this, so after the idea that Jerusalem's going to be able to throw off her chains, we move into a vision of the king returning victorious from the battle so that the city is saved. And you get the idea that, like, you can hear the messengers coming from far off and they're bringing good news, and the joy that that elicits, right? You see the watchmen on the wall see that God is returning, and has saved the people. So this idea of God as the victorious king establishing the kingdom, is another vivid image in that text, and it shifts, and then we get a view of the people depart, depart. It echoes that awake, awake. And what they're doing is they're leaving captivity and returning. And we saw all kinds of reversals from a similar passage in Lamentation where they're coming back to the city. It's holy, it's not rushed, it's a stately procession instead of being scattered in fear. So yeah, the whole passage was really filled with these vivid images, and we talked about what they meant. My dog is throwing a fit. She'll be okay. We saw how what they meant, to the people is God's protection of them, God's return to them, and taking care of them after this time of suffering. Any other thoughts?
The Lord will go before and behind.
Yeah, that procession, where they are coming back to the land, kind of looked like their time in the Exodus when God was the fiery, cloudy pillar. God's presence was in that form, but at the front and at the back of their community. And so that idea that God would be right there with them. Great point. Yeah, what else? What else stands out to you? Okay, well, we'll get into today's passage. Now, so we're going to start in 52:13, and it is like 3 verses of 52, and then that with all of 53 is really one long poem. It's a single poem, and these first 3 verses are actually mirrored by the last couple of verses of chapter 53. And so, very often we would read it all together so that that mirroring comes out, but there's too much to unpack here. So instead, let's read the first 3 verses, 52 verses 13 through 15, please, if someone would do that.
I'll read those.
Thank you.
Behold, my servant shall act wisely. He shall be high and lifted up and shall be exalted. As many were astonished at you, his appearance was so marred beyond human semblance, and his form beyond that of children of mankind. So shall he sprinkle many nations. Kings shall shut their mouths because of him. For that which has not been told them they see, and that which they have not heard they understand.
I have to unmute. Thank you. The dog was throwing a fit because she could see her squeaker toy just outside the door. So then when I tried to let her out while you were reading, she just grabbed her squeaker toy. And so then I had to take that away from her so that we would not be listening to squeakers. Yeah. So, okay. Thank you so much for reading that. Okay. So we have this, let's start in verse 13. We have this opening line, and it's about the servant of the Lord, right? We have seen the servant show up multiple times in multiple passages, right? What do we learn about the servant in verse 13?
He will be raised and lifted up, highly exalted.
Yeah, so it's this. Okay, so that first line, the servant will prosper. This is a word that means um, be prudent. And so what the meaning in here is like the servant will have the kind of wisdom that brings success. So usually when we see this word, it's talking about a king who rules well and therefore their kingdom is successful, right? Or, something similar to that where true, good choices don't always lead to good results. Sometimes it doesn't work that way. But that general wisdom that when you rule well, that the results, ripple outwards, and that there's, as he says, this is my servant. My servant will be like a king who acts wisely. NIV that's why it's um some translations will say my servant will prosper and some will say acts wisely. It's because it's this kind of combination idea. Do well so that wellness results, right? So my servant will prosper, my servant will be high and lifted up and greatly exalted. And this idea of the exaltation of the servant is where we begin our passage, and it will be where we end our passage at the end of 53 as well. So our first question might be, who is this servant, right? What were our previous options? Who have we seen as identified as the servant so far in this section of Isaiah?
Israel?
Israel, yeah, the people as a whole. So the whole country, the people of God have been identified. You are my servant, Israel. Jacob is my servant. We've seen that multiple times. Yeah. And who else? You might look back at Isaiah 49, verses 1 through 6. We want to kind of turn over there. We see someone speaking. Um, the Lord called me from the womb, from the body of my mother, he named me. He's made my mouth like a sharp sword. Who do we think is speaking there?
Is it Isaiah?
Yeah, the prophet, right? So, like, it may be whether you count it as Isaiah, the first Isaiah, or a second Isaiah who is a prophet or a poet. Yes. So, that idea, like, and that person is also, verse 3, he said to me, you are my servant, Israel. So, we had a situation back here, and we talked about it at the time, where we have, yes, Israel as a whole is the servant of God. And then here we have the prophet called out as one person to represent the many. So Israel is still a servant, but now the prophet is individually identified as the servant also. Okay, turning back over to the end of 52, where we were in 52:13, we see that either of these interpretations could fit a little bit, right? This chapter has several sections that are quoted in the New Testament, and we'll go over them at the kind of at the end of the lesson. So there is a view that we take from a far distance, but we want to start with the view that the original readers would have had. So they're reading this and they're going, okay, is this Israel as a whole? Is it the prophet individually? And so those are kind of the choices that we see here, okay? The servant is going to be high and lifted up, but also greatly exalted. It's a little more than we might expect out of just either Israel or the prophets. Although, some of this could be about Israel, right? What else is Israel? If the servant is going to be high and lifted up, what else happens that's not so high and lifted up in these verses?
His form was marred beyond human likeness.
Okay. marred beyond human likeness, marred more than any man, disfigured, even the NIV says. So, yes, the servant, the nation of Israel has indeed been abused. We talked about that. And when we talked about the cup of wrath images, right? The prophet, well, if this is about a prophet individually, then the prophet's in for some rough days coming up, right? The prophet might be like, wait, are we talking about me? This sounds bad, right? So it gets quite interesting in verse 15. The servant will do what for many nations?
Mine says sprinkle, but I think it means like startle them.
Okay, mine says sprinkle. What does yours say, Terry?
Different device. I can't get off mute very quickly. It's a sprinkle as well. That's why I was shaking my head.
Yeah. Yeah. So startle is really just conjecture that some commentators have made because the word sprinkle is surprising here, and the word for startle is only one letter away in Hebrew. But the word is sprinkle. So the passage here does say sprinkle. Well, sprinkle them how? What when do you sprinkle something?
The kings will shut their mouths because of them.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that might mean stop their bragging, maybe. That shut their mouths, right? This language of sprinkle is probably language out of the sacrificial system of ancient Israel. So so you can read more about this in like Leviticus 4 through 6 if you want to. It reads like a list of rules. It's not. It's a little repetitive because it has some quite interesting little nuggets in it too. If you want to go look at that, but these are rules for a sin offering or a guilt offering, and an animal would be offered, and the blood would then be sprinkled on or around the altar. And it is that same word here. And if you read in the NIV, sometimes they will use the word splash, but they're just being I don't know. That's a stylistic choice. It's the same. The Hebrew word has not changed. It's a sprinkle again when it says splash in the NIV. So listen to Leviticus 5:9. This is the priest, the one administering the sacrifice, shall also sprinkle some of the blood of the sin offering on the side of the altar, while the rest of the blood shall be drained out at the base of the altar. It is a sin offering. So we look at this passage, thus so verse 15, he seems to be the servant, right? The servant will sprinkle many nations. So this may be talking about something to do with sacrifice and the purification system. Well, who does the sprinkling in those cases?
The priest.
A priest does, right? So in this parallel, the servant is somehow the priest. Okay, well, that makes sense. But what is the offering? What blood is being sprinkled? It's not at all clear. The nations are being sprinkled, but with what? From what? And so we're left recognizing here that the offering is not really obvious. And we see that because of this sprinkling, the kings will shut their mouths, as Shirley pointed out. Maybe, that may be about stopping their boasting. And then what else will they do?
They will understand.
Okay, they're going to understand what they had not heard. They will see what they had not been told. Listen to this. For what they had not been told and what they had not heard. Doesn't that sound like the opposite of do you not know? Have you not heard? You know, that key passage in Isaiah 40, beginning in verse 28, that we opened our study with, you know, we have this idea that, like, do you not know, have you not heard, the Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. And so it would fit with so many times in these Isaiah passages that when God does something for Israel, part of the benefit is that people see and hear. The nations see it, they hear it, and they know that God is God, right? That witness is provided to them. They see and hear that the Lord is the everlasting God. And so it seems here what they had not been told and what they had not heard, they will see and understand. We may be talking about how when the nations are somehow sprinkled, covered by some offering that we don't yet understand, good thing we have more of this passage to go, right? That they will get the witness that the Lord is the everlasting God. Okay. So God has been working to rescue Israel, and part of the effect is that the nations will know God, right? However, usually when people sin, the law tells them, okay, go offer a sacrifice. That's a pattern you can see really clearly in that Leviticus 4-6 if you go and read those chapters. You sacrifice. The principle behind a sacrifice is that you bring an animal that has no defects, no blemishes, and it's a symbol of the sin that you have committed, that I have committed, being transferred to the sacrificial animal. The sacrificial animal dies in place of the sinner, leaving the sinner purified before God and able to approach the presence of God. Then the animal is, you know, most often provides food. You know, it's eaten in most cases. In a few cases, the whole thing is burned, but mostly this is a system which provides meat in a way, you know, that's not different necessarily than how people would eat in other cultures. But the idea of that sin being transferred and that the animal dying in the place so that the person can be with God is the kind of the theory of the sin offering. And so when we see this word sprinkle, and it is so surprising that some commentators are like, maybe they didn't even mean that word. Maybe they meant startle. Okay, do you think startle makes more sense? I don't know. I don't think startle is more obvious what it would mean either. But yeah, so this setup, this first 3 verses opens a question that the rest of the passage is going to address, right? It's like, what's going on here? There seems to be an offering. Wait, what offering? Wait, God is going to bring us back and forgive us, but has there been any offering for sin? And is that part of it? And how does that work? And so that's the question that is opened as we read the rest of this passage. Questions or comments on that?
Yeah, I got a question. On the animal sacrifice, could that be a clean animal or could it be an unclean animal?
No, it had to be a clean animal, and there were specific animals. So, like if it was the whole community, then it would be a bull. If it was a person, it would be a lamb. If they couldn't afford that, it would be 2 doves. If they couldn't afford that, they could even just do some grain, you know. So there was kind of a set of possible animals, and it wasn't just anything. And I think the lamb is probably the lamb is like the default guilt offering. And so the lamb is the title animal, like the lamb is normally what it is. Which, later when we see several elements of Jesus as the lamb, or talking about the lamb, in this passage, the lamb is the most common, so that's why we're seeing that. Other questions? Okay, well, will somebody read 53 verses 1 through 12? It's the whole chapter. It's just not a very long chapter.
I can do that.
Thank you.
Who has believed our message, and whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? He grew up before him like a tender shoot, and like a root out of the dry ground. He had no beauty or majesty to attract him to us. Nothing in his appearance we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by man, a man of sorrows and familiar sufferings. Like the men who hid their faces, he was despised, and we esteemed him not. Surely he took our infirmities and carried our sorrows, yet considered him stricken by God, smitten by him, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us to peace was upon him, and by his wounds we are healed. We are like sheep who have gone astray. Each of us turned to his own way, and the Lord laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before her shears, silent. So he did not open his mouth. By oppression and judgment he was taken away. But who can speak of his descendants? For he was cut off from the land of the living. For the transgressions of my people he was stricken. He was assigned a grave with the wicked, and with the rich in his death. Though he had no violence, nor was any deceit in his mouth, yet it was the Lord who will crush him and curse him to suffer. And through the Lord, and though the Lord makes his life guilt and offering, he will see his offspring and prolong his days, and the will of the Lord will prosper in his hands. And the suffering of his soul, he will see the light of life. He will be satisfied. By his knowledge, by my righteous servant will justify many, and he will bear their iniquities. Therefore, I will give him a portion among the great, and he will divide the spoils with the strong, because he's poured out his life into death. He was numbered with his transgressors, for he bore the sins of many, and he made intercession for the transgressions.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so going back to verse 1, God has been speaking, in 52, 13 through 15, that's kind of my servant. So God was the voice in those. And then the prophet seems to be speaking now, but he isn't speaking in first person. We looked back at that 49, the 1 through 6, and he was saying, I did this, I did that. He's speaking of himself. Well, now the prophet seems to be speaking of someone else, right? And we could take this to mean the children of Israel. We'd have to work pretty hard to make some elements, a few elements of it make sense, though. And so we have this sense that, like, okay, something is surprising here. This is maybe a new and different servant than we have seen in previous passages. Okay, verse 1, we have that familiar expression, the arm of the Lord, which we know means the power of the Lord, right? But here we see the power of the Lord, the arm of the Lord is been revealed. He grew up. So there is some idea that the arm of the Lord is a person, is the servant himself. And so if the servant is the arm or the power of the Lord, then how will that power show up in the world? Okay. Verse 2. What is the servant like?
The young plant.
Okay, a tender shoot, a
Yeah.
young plant. What's that? What's a young plant like?
Mm. Well, it has so much potential and yet it's so delicate.
Okay, something small, something delicate, not something to stomp and throw its weight around, right? This is something little, and also like a root out of parched ground. This may be drawing back to Isaiah 11:1, where an heir of David, the son of Jesse, will bring righteousness to the world. It says in 11:1, then a shoot will spring from the stem of Jesse. Jesse is King David's father. A shoot will spring from the stem of Jesse, and a branch from his roots will bear fruit. So there may be an element that we're seeing like this is an offspring of someone we know. And it sounds gentle, doesn't it?
Mm.
This also reminds me, look back at Isaiah 42. Look at verses 1 through 4 in that chapter. Behold my servant whom I uphold, my chosen one in whom my soul delights. I have put my spirit on him. He will bring forth justice to the nations. He will not cry out and raise his voice, nor make his voice heard in the street. A bruised reed he will not break, and a dimly burning wick he will not snuff out. He will faithfully bring forth justice. And it goes on in that vein. We talked when we studied this passage about how bringing forth justice to the nation seems like a pretty tall order, seems a little beyond the capability of either Israel or the Isaiah here, the prophet here, right? And so maybe there's more to the servant. And doesn't that line up so closely with the root out of parched ground, right? So we see one more thing. What is this else is the servant like in verse 2?
Formless.
Say again?
Formless.
Formless. Okay.
No
He has
beauty.
No beauty or majesty.
okay. No stately form is how mine puts it. Yeah, formless, no majesty. Right. He is not drawing people to him with his appearance, is he? Instead, how do people feel about him? Verse 3.
Despised and rejected.
Yeah. What's to despise? Why is this person so despised?
I don't know. I'm looking at the phrase where it says from whom men hide their faces. And to
Yeah.
me, that seems like something either they're not worthy of or they're grossed out about, or like they see as bearing shame or
Yeah. I think
some.
grossed out about or see as bearing shame. Yeah. I think those are really good. I mean, and even though that's a funny way to put it, I think there's something to it, right? This person is so weighed down with sorrows and griefs, right? A man of sorrows and acquainted with griefs, or your translation may have pains or sicknesses. He's so weighed down that he's too disturbing to even look at, right? He's carrying all these afflictions. And because of these afflictions, he looks guilty or contemptible, right? He must be a terrible person to be carrying all of this badness, all these afflictions, right? And don't we think this way sometimes, right? The person who is dirty or abused, that isn't who we want to look at sometimes. We might assume that they're just, that they, I don't know, sometimes maybe we're guilty of assuming they deserve what they have or the afflictions that they're bearing, whether we know it or not,
Or we're
right?
guilty of not, we're convicted ourselves about not doing anything about it.
Yeah, yeah. That person must, we can't do anything about it. They, and you see it in here as well. He must be smitten of God, right? In verse 4. Maybe God wanted it that way, right? So what in verse, so we could read all of this as being about God's servant Israel, right? Israel was small and weak. Israel was not impressive or compelling to the other nations. Israel became despised by the nations and overwhelmed with their suffering in the exile, right? But we, beginning in verse 4, we get a departure into something different, into something more, into the twist that word sprinkle set us up for. Why is the servant so disfigured? What is the servant bearing in verse 4?
The sins of the world.
Yeah, it's and not just of other people, but of me, right? Our sorrows, our griefs, right? This idea comes up so many times in this passage, right? Where, how many, so many, but call out, see if you can identify some places where our sorrows are on this servant. Where does that show up?
Our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities,
Yeah, verse
the
5.
punishment that brought us peace. Yeah,
Yeah,
and then keep going. Like he was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. And there's just, yeah, it's a lot of repetition.
yeah, it really, really wants to communicate this idea, doesn't this passage? Like it's our transgressions, our iniquities, the chastening for our. Now that has a little extra idea in it, right? The chastening, yes, it's for our iniquities, but it's going to provide something in verse 5. What is it going to provide?
Healing.
Healing, right? So the servants accepting these punishments, the results of our sins will not just weigh down the servant with afflictions, it will also produce something good. Our wholeness, right? Our peace, shalom, is the chastening for our well being, our peace, our shalom fell upon him. It will produce something good as well. Verse 6, the iniquity of us all is falling on him. Verse 8, um, uh, the transgression of my people to whom the stroke was due, right? It's this is a longer one. He was cut off for the transgression of my people. That's like the stroke of a beating, right? Verse 11, bear their iniquities. Verse 12, bore the sin of many, right? And so I think it all kind of comes to a head in verse 10. What is the servant in verse 10?
The offspring.
Yeah, I don't think I understand.
Well, I'm going to
That's
look at another translation because I'm wondering. So, yet it was the Lord's will to crush him and cause him to suffer. And the Lord makes his life a
A
what?
grief offering.
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 Yeah. In my translation, it says he will render himself as a guilt offering. I'll have to look more closely at the words there. That idea, so the guilt offering is an official offering from the sacrificial system, right? That's in that Leviticus passage for chapters 5 and 6, if you want to read that. So this idea is that the offering takes on the person, it takes on the sin of the person, but somehow the servant is now being presented as if he is a guilt offering. But sacrifices were always animals. God had never allowed people to offer a human, and child sacrifice, as practiced by some of the surrounding nations, was considered abomination before the Lord. It was one of the ways that the priesthood of the Israelites had shed innocent blood and was considered guilty before God, right? So this figure is somehow an offering, but it seems to be more different, enhanced, something more than just the lamb offering, right? We have in verse 10 that he renders himself, right? This is an animal can't choose to participate, right? Animals can make choices, but they can't choose to be a sacrificial offering, right? That's not a choice animal can make. And then that idea that it provides healing, it provides well-being that we saw. And then even down all the way in verse 12, the servant interceded for the transgressors. So it's the priest that is the intercessor. The priest is the go-between, but somehow this servant is both the go-between and the offering, right? It's more than just offering.
I like it where it says the will of the Lord will prosper in his hands.
Okay, yeah, he will be satisfied. He is going to be the righteous one, right? He's going to be we've talked about righteousness over and over, and how Isaiah really hits hard this concept of righteousness as God's right action to bring about God's rescue of God's people, right? So that idea that that this servant will be the righteous one as well. And we see also in the sense of the willingness towards the offering. What do you see in verse 7 that makes us think that this servant is willing to be the guilt offering?
He did not open his mouth.
Yeah. Silent before the shearers, did not open his mouth, not protesting, not trying to get away. And so, thinking about this passage in its original context, being part of the story of God's rescue of the Israelites from exile, we have this idea that yes, God can and will rescue them, and that's already been established. But all along, they may have been missing an element of forgiveness and healing from sin that landed them in exile in the first place, right? They have drunk the cup of wrath, they have served their time, but is God bringing them back enough to heal them? Because we have seen through these chapters of Isaiah that God is always thinking bigger, right? Let's remember God's statement to the prophet. This is from 49:6. So the passage that we went back and looked at the beginning. The Lord says, "It is too small a thing that you should be my servant to raise up the tribes of Jacob and restore the preserved ones of Israel." It's like, yes, I'm going to rescue Israel, but that's not enough. I want to do more. Continuing in verse 6, I will also make you a light to the nations so that my salvation may reach the end of the earth. So today's passage in that original context is quite a surprise. We're seeing that God is like bringing the stakes up. There's something more than just the rescue that is going to happen. God wants to redeem out of exile, but God also wants to redeem out of sin and guilt, right? All through this passage, every different Hebrew word for sin is used. There's iniquity, guilt, transgression. Like it goes through the whole like gamut of words for sin. And so like, and the repetition, right? Like Terry mentioned, like it's this idea that we really want to convey this idea that the behaviors that are hurting us can be taken away. We have a servant who is somehow going to do much more, provide forgiveness, provide healing, bring shalom or well-being and wholeness, and bring it to the whole world. So it's a surprise. It's a departure from just what we've seen so far. And we see why this passage came to be regarded as messianic by Jewish interpreters before the time of Jesus, right? Because you look at this and you say, oh, there's more to God's plan. God is going to send a special servant who is willing to undergo these afflictions so that he can bring healing to us all, right? Questions or comments on that idea or on this passage so far?
So time-wise, like I know I feel like we've done this before, but like from this passage to Christ, like what would have the time, how long would they have had to wait?
Yeah, so this would have been like, well, I think it's 439 BC that Cyrus sends them back. So, like right around 550 years.
Wow.
Yeah,
Many,
there's
many generations. Yeah.
generations and many troubles. The Israelites, they get back to Jerusalem and then they have a lot of troubles in between, right? There's conquerors and oppressors, and it's a whole string of people who are in charge of the Jews, and there's only a little slice of time where they get to rule themselves. And so, yeah, over time, the expectation builds that there will be an anointed one. That's what Messiah means. That's what it translates to. An anointed one who is somehow a root of Jesse, a descendant of David, who is somehow going to provide this kind of healing, is somehow going to take the iniquity of us all on himself and by that provide healing. Right? So when Jesus comes on the scene, right, it becomes, any wonder that he quickly, that people quickly began to identify this passage with Jesus, right? It totally makes sense. What parts of this passage do you see that apply to Jesus?
I keep looking back at
The whole
what
thing.
says,
Oh, I missed everybody. Shirley, what did you say?
what I keep looking at is where it says, we all, like sheep, have gone astray, each of us turning from our own wicked way.
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
really hits hard because that's even true today.
It is. Yeah.
I mean, just 7 through like this verse 7 just sums it up. He was oppressed and afflicted, but did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as sheep before her shears is silent, he did not open his mouth. It felt like so much of like he knew his face, right? It was that so much of it.
Yeah, and I may have missed a little part because you broke up a little bit, or at least for me, maybe not for everybody. But all 4 Gospels make a point to mention in Jesus' trial, every single one of them, to mention that Jesus didn't answer back, and Jesus said nothing, and he said nothing to them. So in that trial and not saying anything, that is a very, like, you can tell that they're intentionally, bringing out that common point. Yeah. What'd you say, Judy?
Well, when we were reading through it initially, chapter 5 probably stood out the loudest, which was, but he was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and with his wounds we are healed.
Yeah.
It's just really powerful to me.
It is so powerful, isn't it? Yeah. So this, we'll go through it a little bit, but yeah, I think it is kind of tender in that it is personal, in that it is for us. It's so clear how Jesus took on the suffering that he did out of his great love and desire for us to be healed from the things that mess up our lives, right? From the sin that so easily entangles, as Paul said. And we see that after, and Jesus is uh, raised, right? And so it's so interesting, like he becomes a guilt offering, but then verse 10, he sees his offspring and prolongs his days. Like, how can you both have days and be, and so we sort of take out of the, although not that we think that Jesus had direct offspring, but just that idea of the how the church flourishes and his resurrection to see those days. We also see after that the ascension, right? And so my servant is high and lifted up and greatly exalted. Just as from Philippians 2:9, we saw that Jesus was exalted after his sacrifice and his resurrection, right? Um, in 52, in 52:15, this idea that everyone will begin to see the truth, will see salvation because of this offering, because of the sprinkling, the offering that's given. Paul quotes this passage in Romans 15:21, and he uses it to mean that the nations, the Gentile nations he's talking about, right? Because he's a Jew and he's talking about the nations, will get to learn the gospel of Jesus Christ, even those who had never heard of God before. And so he quotes what had not been told them, they will see, and what they had not heard, they will understand. In 53:1, John, the gospel author John, quotes this passage: who has believed our message, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? He's talking about how, well, I'll read it to you. John 12:36-38. These things Jesus spoke, and he went away and hid himself from them. But though he had performed so many signs before them, yet they were not believing him. And this was to fulfill the word of Isaiah the prophet, which he spoke: Lord, who has believed our message, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? Right? So John says, yeah, Jesus did all of it, but people didn't believe it when it was right in front of them. Right? These words in surely our griefs he bore and our sorrows he carried. Matthew quotes this passage. He uses it because sorrows can also be translated as illnesses. And Matthew uses it to talk about Jesus' healing ministry. The pattern of bringing bodily healing that demonstrated the healing that God could provide. This idea of the lamb that was led to the slaughter, right? All four gospels make a point that Jesus didn't answer back during his trial. And that idea of Jesus as a sacrificial lamb comes up, right? When we see the Passover and Jesus instituting the Lord's Supper on the Passover, the idea is that Jesus is the new Passover lamb. And then in Revelation, a metaphorical way of talking about Jesus in Revelation is a lamb looking as if it had been slain, the guilt offering who has already offered himself, right? In verse 8, by oppression and judgment, he was taken away. This is the passage. And he was, for his generation, he was cut off from the land of the living. I don't know if you remember in Acts, there's an Ethiopian official, an Ethiopian eunuch, who's like traveling along and like trying to figure out Isaiah. Like he's like, boy, I don't know how to read this. And Philip, like appears there after having been the apostles are all scattered from Jerusalem, and the Holy Spirit sends Philip to talk to this Ethiopian, and the Ethiopian is reading this passage, and he's like, what am I supposed to make of this? Who is the prophet talking about? Is he talking about himself or somebody else? Well, wait, that's exactly the question we would ask, right? What's going on in this passage? And Philip begins at that very passage to tell the gospel of Jesus Christ. So this is like, this is the way that God begins to unveil the Christian story, the story that Jesus will surprise everyone with. And it is surprising. It's surprising here, and then how it's fulfilled is also surprising. Matthew specifies that Jesus was in a rich man's grave, probably to tie it to verse 9. And in Luke, Jesus says from verse 12, I must fulfill the word of the prophet, and he was numbered with the transgressors. And so Jesus himself points to this beautiful poem of the suffering servant and says, this is what I am doing for you. I am providing the sacrifice to bring the salvation that provides healing and wholeness, right? And so we have this idea, the servant is Israel, the servant is the prophet that represents Israel, the servant is also the descendant that comes out of Israel, who is the Christ, the Messiah, who will do all of these things. Questions or comments on this passage?
Yeah, Deanne, I have a question on verse 12 where it says, therefore I will divide him a portion with the many. What's the significance of that?
What translation is that?
That's the ESV.
So I have allot him a portion with the great. And NIV has give him a portion among the great. So I think that may just be a different word choice that makes that line more confusing.
It felt a little ambiguous. It's just
Yeah,
trying to...
I feel like it's that this is supposed to mirror the high and lifted up and greatly exalted from the beginning of the poem. And so that portion with the great and divide the
Okay.
plunder with the strong is supposed to be a sense of Jesus' exaltation after his resurrection. The ascension is maybe the most literal tie to Jesus, right? But remember, it also means something in its original language, so it's original context. So yeah, both and.
Thank you.
It also says he was despised and rejected. In the New Testament, he was despised and rejected by his own people.
Indeed,
And also, it also says, what good is anyone out of Nazareth? How can somebody from Nazareth be the Christ?
Yeah, I was just reading in John today, and they're like, I had forgotten this. The Pharisees are like, come on, how can you think he's a Messiah? He came from Galilee. And then Nicodemus steps up and goes, well, I mean, we don't condemn someone without at least listening to them. And they go, are you from Galilee too? Like it's very snotty. But I think, and to me that was kind of funny. But also, like when you look at it more seriously, just the ongoing abuse that Jesus took from the leadership of his people and how he was pursued and persecuted over time, right? There's multiple times where it's like, are you really going to go back to Judea? They're trying to kill you there. And so Jesus spent quite a lot of his ministry in danger of being killed by his people, right? And so that despised, it's a good point. Well, I want to finish with a passage from First Peter, and it is a summary of the gospel, but there are so many ties to this passage that it's kind of uncanny. And I want to read it and point out the ties. And so if that makes the reading a little disjointed, you can go back to it. It's First Peter 2:21 through 25. And Peter has been giving practical instruction for living God's way. And he ends that a little practical section with the possibility that they will suffer even when they do right. So starting in 21, for you have been called for this purpose, since Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example for you to follow in his footsteps. And he quotes from verse 9, who committed no sin, nor was any deceit found in his mouth. And while being reviled, he did not revile in return, did not open his mouth, right? While suffering, he uttered no threats. That verse 7, but kept entrusting himself to him who judges righteously. Such a key word for Isaiah, right? And he himself bore our sins, an idea that is in multiple verses in this passage, right? In his body on the cross, so that we might die to sin and live to righteousness. For by his wounds you are healed. From verse 5. For you were continually straying like sheep. Verse 6. But now you have returned to the shepherd and guardian of your souls. And then Peter continues in his practical advice for Christian living. He sort of just waxes theological there. He just like opens up in a statement of the gospel, and it parallels the elements of this passage so beautifully. Well, this has been a great exploration of some of the, I think, richest theology of God's plan of salvation in the Old Testament. So thank you for your discussion and your participation today. Next week, we will do Isaiah 54, the whole chapter, in Lesson 12, Restoration in Israel. And I have sent y'all an email, so if you didn't get it, let me know. We're going to narrow down our choices for what we want to study next 2 semesters, and I'd love to hear if you have some final selections that we should consider. What are the finalists? All right. Any other comments before we go to prayer time? Thanks. Okay.